What was the weirdest or creepiest neighbor you've ever had? Story 1. I had a really creepy neighbor, probably a man in his early 40s. I was in 7th grade when I first met him. He seemed like a nice guy, but there was just something off about him. My mother is very patriotic, and our whole house was decorated red, white, and blue inside. One day, while I was walking home from school, he was sitting on his front lawn and told me he was having a red, white, and blue sale in his backyard and that I should check it out. I told him sure, but said I needed to go get money first, then walked off. My neighbor right next door was a big guy in his mid-30s, covered in prison tattoos, but he had turned his life around. He was very intimidating if you didn't know him. Since my parents weren't home, I went to his house and told him what happened. He walked over with me to the creepy guy's house, and sure enough, the backyard was filled with red, white, and blue items for sale. Even then, I still felt something was off. 2 years later, that man was arrested for attempting to lure a child into his house. Story 2. When I was a kid, we had a neighbor who was fairly nice, unless you stepped on his lawn or, especially, went into his backyard. You know how it is when you're a kid, a ball or something will go over the fence and you'll have to jump over and get it. He had all these wires and stuff strung up all over the yard, and he always took his trash out in the middle of the night, not to the curb, but loaded large trash bags into his vehicle and drove away a couple of times a week. One night my mom and I were sitting in the living room watching TV when a bunch of men in black vans arrived at his house. It was the police and the DEA. The guy had been running a meth lab inside his house in the middle of a nice family neighborhood, one street over from an elementary school. Suddenly, it made sense why he didn't want anyone on his lawn. He was afraid we would get a closer look at what he had inside. We watched the police bring items and evidence out of his house all night long. It was intense and, honestly, kind of surreal. Story 3. They are 3 humans, confirmed, who moved here from Korea. I live in an apartment complex of 40 units. They are our neighbors to the left and 1 floor up, 3 floors total, and we all have our own balconies. The 3 characters are very important, so here are brief descriptions. The son, middle-aged, always wears a black pea coat, trench coat at all times of the year. He's only home once or twice a month, but stays for a couple of days at a time. The mother, old as petrified fossil dust, always looks down her nose and will stare you down. She's very small and frail and pushes a laundry cart around the parking lot. One day she berated a man fixing a flat tire for 20 minutes because he needed to move his truck. The daughter, the main villain, is around 60, largely overweight. This is relevant to the story. I don't care about anyone's physicality. I've lost 65 pounds myself, cackles, and has a problem with everyone in the building except the ferret, video game, gardener guy, our upstairs neighbor. The start, first encounter last summer, when COVID was rampant, I decided a nice new hobby would be growing herbs. My husband and I love to cook, so I bought a bunch of starter packets and watered them every day. One day I walked out to water again, and she came outside and shouted into the parking lot. Nobody there. About how disgusting tattoos are. I have a half sleeve on my right arm. Not wanting an issue, I went back inside confused and texted my husband. I heard her go back in, so I went out and finished watering my plants. And she came out again, and this time shouted down to me that something smelled bad and asked what I was doing because she could smell it. I politely said I didn't smell anything and came back inside. Second encounter, my husband and I rearranged our balcony furniture so we could eat dinner outside since it was beautiful. We're pretty quiet people. No loud music, just talking. And the daughter came out and yelled down, "I don't like what you've done there. Change it back." My husband, who everyone describes as a gentle giant, looked at me after she slammed the door and said under his breath, "Wow, what a bitch," which is notable because he's not like that. Later that evening, the cops showed up at our apartment. My husband and I had just been grocery shopping, so weren't home for a bit. The cop, laughing under his breath, started by apologizing. "I'm sorry to bother you guys. We got a call about someone named Tracy and Michael harassing some of your neighbors." We clarified we don't know a Tracy, and he told us they called because, get this, we copy them. And sometimes my husband gets into my car. We both have vehicles. The cop said he tried to explain that husband and wife share vehicles too, but the ladies ranted about how dangerous we are and said they felt threatened. He told us to contact the building manager if they bother us again. I called the building manager and said, "Hi, My husband and I have unfortunately had a couple of negative interactions with another unit in the building, and she sighed and said, "The Asians?" It took me aback, not wanting to be simple or engage like that. I said, "I believe they are of Asian descent, yes." She told me to write a report and said, "They target someone new every month." Third encounter, I was outside warming up for a run when the daughter came out onto her balcony and started barking at me. I knew who it was and didn't look up, and she then meowed, just in case I'm more of a cat person. I took off running. Fourth encounter, the maintenance guy, who used to live across the hall, knocked on my door. He'd moved out not long before, and said, "I just had no idea. You think you know a person," then started laughing. "The ladies from Korea and 40 just told me you're a drug dealer and that you plan to kidnap them." At this point I was laughing, but also furious. I ignored it because I realized they were trying to get a response out of me, and if I didn't engage, I wouldn't have to worry. Fifth encounter, I was walking into the building from my car, and they were walking out. I was close enough that any normal person would hold the door, but knowing the history, I kept my head down. The daughter wanted so badly to make me have to unlock the door that she slammed it shut behind her, forgetting her mother was behind her. The mother squealed, stuck in the door, and pinned with her walker on the lip of the door frame. I stopped and looked another direction, waiting patiently. As soon as she dislodged the mother, the daughter pushed the door shut harder and laughed at me. I waited for them to walk by and sighed as I walked through. Then I heard shouting getting closer. The daughter whipped the door open and started absolutely screaming at me. "What did you say?" "You said something, we heard it." I froze and the mother joined in. "Tell us what you said." All I could mutter was, "I just said excuse me," which wasn't true. I hadn't said anything. But they frightened me so much I lied. I called my husband and the building manager. She told me to write a report and said they were trying to get them out, but the more reports they had, the better. Then, the fifth encounter happens again. My best friend and I spent the day together. When we came back, she dropped me at my car near the dumpster because I had errands to run. I saw a woman at the dumpster, Granny, and my friend, who knows everything, just sat in the lot with me while I stayed in the car. The daughter ripped out of her parking space and blocked my friend's car. The mother walked toward the car, and I got in mine. The mother went to my friend's window and screamed at her about how fast she'd come into the parking lot and repeatedly asked where she lived. My friend is a nurse with the patience of a saint, but she eventually rolled up her window when the woman wouldn't stop repeating herself. She backed up and left the other way that wasn't blocked, and the neighbors honked their horn trying to get her to come back. I laughed that my friend had to experience it too, and she told me what the mother had been saying. I waited for them to pull away and back out of my spot. Then they slammed on their brakes and tried to block me in. I was mad but refused to engage because they're obviously not right. I backed up the other way and left. They followed me to the post office and pulled in behind me. My heart was pounding, but I thought, if they do anything, there are tons of witnesses here. I took my coat off and went inside. The mother walked right past me and asked the mail clerk if he'd seen anyone suspicious looking. I was standing behind her filling out a mailing address on a package. She was literally looking for me while I was less than 3 feet away. I sneaked out while she berated the poor guy, went home, and ran into the apartment and called the building manager, who said I should have called the cops. I wasn't trying to lock anyone up, so I refused. The story is ongoing, but I don't know how much wilder it can get from here. Story 4. I've been fortunate not to have any truly creepy or weird neighbors. My oddest neighbor was also my coolest. He was my landlord, in his 60s, and his grandfather had built the house I lived in, so it was well over 100 years old, which is quite rare in New Zealand. Both his grandfather and his father had died in that house, which perhaps explains some of the weird and creepy experiences I had there. He basically had a museum in his basement of artifacts he had found over the decades. Some pieces were worth hundreds of thousands, and the entire collection would have been worth millions in the 1990s. It would be worth tens of millions now if they were still alive. They're both dead now, and I don't know what happened to his collection. I hope a museum took it. He used to stay up until 3 or 4 a.m. watching TV while kneeling on a small, dirty towel and never sat in a chair. Whenever I had insomnia, I'd go over, have a cup of tea with him, and chat while we watched South Park, which he loved. He had done some amazing things in his life, so it was always great to chat with him. He spent years helping eradicate pests from islands around New Zealand to save various native species, and his best friend literally single-handedly helped save the kakapo from extinction. I met that friend several times, and he never mentioned it once. Only years later, when I read Douglas Adams' Last Chance to See, did I realize who that taciturn, slightly grumpy old bugger was, and I wish I'd read Adams earlier so I could have got him to sign it. Every Friday, I would pop over to pay the rent. Usually his wife had made cookies, and I'd have a cup of tea and a bicky before handing over the money. If I ever went away for the weekend, he would deduct rent. Can't charge you rent when you're not there. And would often slip me another $20 on top of the discount for spending money. He'd also give me a week's free rent for Christmas and on my birthday, and he was already charging way less than the market rate. The weirdest thing about him was that he just seemed to know where things were, like he was totally attuned to the universe or something. Once he went to an archaeological site in a swamp that the university had spent a month surveying with a full crew of grad students and equipment, and in that time they found 2 old Mariwaka canoes submerged in the swamp, which they were proud of. He spent a week there camping, waited out where he felt a good spot was, and found 3 more by feeling. With his feet, even pulling out a small wooden spoon that at the time was the only pre-European eating utensil found. He had Maori artifacts in his basement that were literally priceless. He had offered them to the Auckland Museum, but they turned him down because they couldn't afford the gift duties. At that time, the museum only had to pay duties on gifts worth more than $400,000. The average house price where we lived back then was under $100,000, which should give you an idea of the value of his items. Another time he went to a beach, walked behind a sand dune, reached down to grab a handful of sand, and found several pre-European tattooing implements made from bone. Tiny, the size of your fingernail, and he found more in a few minutes than had been found in the entire country up to that point. His wife said all his major finds were like that. Just randomly walking to a spot he felt was interesting, poking around for a couple of minutes, and bam, some artifact of incredible value. He also had a dead kiwi, the bird, in his freezer, along with a massive chunk of ambergris he had found on a random beach walk. One day, he told his wife it was about time she learned to drive. Until then, he had always driven, and she had never bothered to get her license. So he taught her to drive. She got her license, and he bought her a brand new hatchback. They also had a huge old 1970s Holden station wagon he kept in pristine condition. Just a couple of days after getting her the car, he was helping a mate with some DIY, said he felt a bit tired, sat down and died instantly. It really felt like he knew exactly when he was going to die and spent the time beforehand sorting things out so his wife would be okay. Story 5. Not so much creepy as really sad. She was a woman of around 50 who had previously been homeless and lived in the house next to mine, which was government housing. She didn't like her house and would spend her days begging in the city. At night, when she was home, she would smash things in her house and yell sporadically. Her accent changed based on her mood. On the day this story takes place, she spoke with a French accent. One day I came home from work and found her pacing back and forth on the footpath outside our houses. I stopped to ask what was wrong, and she told me she'd locked herself out and insisted I help her break in. She asked if I had a crowbar or hammer. I didn't, but I did have a phone, so I offered to call a locksmith. She shouted that she didn't need a locksmith, she needed the police. I didn't understand how the police could help, but she was insistent. I gave her my phone, and she called them. After a heated exchange, she threw my phone to the ground in frustration, yelled something like, "Fucking fuck, pigs," and began pacing again. She started telling me stories about her life, how she'd been orphaned at a young age and had lived in institutions most of her life. When she spoke about those places, her French accent disappeared, and she spoke with a very pronounced Australian accent. She told me about her health, which wasn't good, and that she had 7 hernias. She offered to show me. I declined. She showed me anyway. She asked me again for a crowbar. I told her I didn't have any tools, and she screamed. She said I should be the one to call the police, that they'd listen to me. I called the non-emergency line, and the woman who answered audibly sighed when I gave the address and name. Clearly, this wasn't the first time my neighbor had been locked out. Within 5 minutes, 2 squad cars and an ambulance arrived. My neighbor explained, still in her French accent, that all she needed was a crowbar. Her request was refused, and the police took her away. Months later, at a party, I made a reference to my neighbor, and the guy I was talking to said, "Is that the lady with the 7 hernias?" Apparently, she was a regular at the bottle shop where his wife worked. She would walk up to the window, lift her shirt, and press her stomach against the glass as a distraction while her friend stuffed bottles of port down his pants. I've since moved out of that house, but I still see her from time to time in the city, always in the same spot. Story 6. I am not a native speaker. I live in a small medieval town in central Italy and had this really weird, and actually fun, neighbor in the flat right above mine. The building has only 3 apartments. The third belongs to someone working abroad, so it is almost always empty. This guy is a semi-retired engineer, divorced, with a teenage daughter who mostly lived with her mother but spent summers with her father. I have a closet on the stairs where I keep tools and other stuff. It's about 1 square meter, 9 square feet, with a door that is never locked. One morning around 7 a.m., I went to get something from the closet and froze. There was something big and dark moving on the floor. It was the neighbor's daughter, hiding there to sleep because she had lied to her father, saying she would have a sleepover at a friend's while she went clubbing, which she wasn't allowed to do. The reason she wasn't allowed was that a few months earlier her father had been hitting on a much younger girl at that same club. That girl was from a family nobody would mess with, and he was warned that no one from that family should ever show up at the club again. He had been caught driving under the influence several times and had his license suspended twice. He made a living renting out a house he owned in Miami, God knows why and when he bought it, and working as a salesman for utility companies, switching employers every few months and taking many customers with him to the new provider, leaving unpaid bills with the previous company. Many of his customers, especially small businesses, hadn't paid a single bill in years. One night I came home and found he'd left his keys in the outside door. While it's a very safe town, that isn't a good idea. So I took the keys and left a note on his door asking him to call me at any hour. He could have rung the bell, but he had my phone number anyway. The following morning, I opened the kitchen door and found some of the flower vases in my backyard smashed and a chair right below his balcony. I recognized the chair as belonging to a nearby wine bar. I called the neighbor and he asked me to come up and open his apartment door. I found him limping and using a broom as an improvised crutch. After a brief attempt to downplay the situation, he admitted that the night before he'd come home at 3 a.m. so drunk he couldn't call me. So he'd taken a chair the wine bar owner leaves outside, climbed over my backyard wall, and tried to climb up to his balcony. He failed twice, nearly broke his ankle the second time, and smashed my flowers. I hadn't heard anything because my bedroom is on the other side of the building. He finally got into his home by breaking a window but couldn't open his front door from the inside, trapped and injured. I took him to the local hospital but did not wait until he was discharged. Being well known among locals, he only managed to date immigrant women from Eastern Europe and had a couple of rocky relationships. After breaking up with the second one, he found a strange doll, like a voodoo doll, under his bed, so he called the local bishop to exorcise the house, even though he never went to church and was probably an atheist. I once met him on the stairs and noticed he had a black eye. He confessed his daughter had hit him during a fight. He moved to another city right before the COVID lockdown last year, and I believe his new neighbors may have other amazing stories. Story 7. Neighbors moved in across the street from me when I was in middle school. They were very odd people who kept to themselves. It was obvious they had 2 small children who were adopted. Not long after they moved in, the lady came over to apologize to my parents, saying her kids were always screaming and crying. I remember thinking it was really strange because neither my parents nor I had ever heard the kids screaming or crying. Not long after that, my father was home and heard the lady screaming in her backyard. He went over, and she was shouting that she had found her younger child unresponsive. The police arrived, and unfortunately, the child was dead. Then things got intense. Tons of cops, unmarked vehicles, police tape everywhere. To middle school me, it looked like a scene straight out of a movie. It turned out she had beaten the child to death and tried to stage it to look like he had fallen and hit his head on the back patio. Then we found out even more. Our new neighbors had moved out of their last house because they weren't welcome there anymore. Numerous neighbors had reported them to Child Protective Services for abuse. We learned it had even been a local news story in their old area. This was the 1980s, before the internet and all that, so it was much easier to hide your skeletons back then. They only lived across from us for a few months before it all went down. Pretty awful story. Oh, and one more thing. The murder investigation revealed the children weren't even legally adopted. They had basically been purchased. Story 8. It was in the house I grew up in for most of my childhood. It had 3 apartments, two large enough for a family of 4 to live in comfortably, and then a tiny basement apartment for 1 or 2 people, with just one room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. It was like a typical student's apartment, or for someone just moving out of their parents' home, but it was still quite nice and bright for being in the basement, since it wasn't really underground and had proper windows installed. Anyway, a couple actually lived there, and they already seemed fairly old to be in an apartment like that. I'd say they were in their 40s. They both seemed kind of off from the start, quite obese, very withdrawn, never said hello, never seemed to go shopping or outside at all. They gave off a strange vibe, almost like they were hiding something they were embarrassed about. It sounds harsh, but they really had that stereotypically off look, as if they might have been deranged perverts or something. One day, my older sister and I came home, and suddenly we heard the sound of bare feet running down the driveway. Before we knew it, the woman who lived in the basement with her husband or boyfriend came sprinting past us completely naked, everything bouncing around. And then she just stopped at the edge of a very busy street. We lived in the heart of the city, and stood there in a sort of proud pose with her hands on her hips and her head thrown back. We don't know what she did after that because my sister quickly unlocked the door so we could get inside and avoid being seen. I remember they moved out shortly after that incident. Since we were in the process of buying the house at the time, we went down there to renovate, and the apartment was unsettling. The floor was bare, dark concrete. The walls were concrete too. The ceiling was covered in cheap, white foamy tiles. And there was a rectangular pit in the floor, deep enough to reach your knees. I had the strong feeling that they might have actually slept in that pit. Story 9. In my last apartment, there was a glass door to enter the building, and then each unit had its own solid door with a peephole. I lived on the first floor, which was basically half underground, and my windows were at the same level as the parking lot. I had 2 weird neighbors there. One was an older guy who I think had mild dementia. He would stand just inside the building's glass door staring out, which made getting in awkward because he wouldn't acknowledge you until he had to move. In warmer weather, he'd sit in his car with the driver's door wide open, blaring endless love for hours. The other was the tiny older lady next door. We called her Tweety. She was about 5 feet tall, wore giant glasses that magnified her eyes, and owned a wardrobe of Tweety bird clothing. She chain-smoked constantly, and her poor, frail husband, who had a trach tube, trailed after her like a shadow. One night, I was staying elsewhere, and my roommate texted me frantically around 3 a.m. Apparently, if one smoke detector in the building goes off, it triggers them all, so the whole place was beeping and the fire department evacuated everyone. Tweety strolled out in her Tweety PJs with a lit cigarette in her mouth, looking utterly unconcerned, which made my roommate furious. About a year later, Tweety knocked and asked to borrow $5 for late Social Security, so I lent it to her without expecting it back. A few weeks later, I was doing the dishes at night when I heard noises at the door, then tapping at the window above the sink, and then more knocking. Convinced I was about to be murdered, I peered through the peephole to find Tweety just looking in. She was returning the $5, which was a huge relief. Then, about a week later, she came back asking for her $5, as if this was going to be a routine thing. Luckily, my partner, who's much better at saying no than I am, answered the door and shut her down. It was a weird place. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, activate the notification bell, and share a similar story or anything you'd like to say in the comments. See you next time.